All right, gentlemen. Well, I appreciate you being prepared to listen to me this afternoon. I'll try to do my best to run through a rather complex situation concerning the sinking or the loss of a nuclear submarine, SSN 589, the Scorpion. Now, a little bit of background while you're perusing this particular initial slide. As I said, as Dane indicated, I was an employee at Combustion Engineering for a number of years. And as a consequence, in the nuclear power department, I got to know and befriend several retired naval nuclear submarine officers. A lot of these guys were graduates of Annapolis, and so they were really professional naval officers. And because of the little background I had in the Royal Canadian Navy, there was at least some commonality about talking about ships and so forth. And inevitably, we ended up discussing the loss of submarines, in particular the Thresher, and then subsequently the Scorpion. And these gentlemen were quite informed on the loss of the Thresher. But when it came to the Scorpion, there was a lot of tight-lipped responses, comments like, well, I really don't want to talk about that. And I subsequently learned that these gentlemen had basically signed secrecy agreements on their retirement from the Navy. And so they really didn't want to talk about the loss of the Scorpion. But with time and with perseverance, I sort of got an opinion, so to speak, not official, but I did get an opinion as to what actually happened to the Scorpion. So with that in mind, someone suggested, why don't you take a look at this book by Ed Offley? It's entitled Loss of the Scorpion, surprisingly. So I read the book. And of course, it had a profound effect on my viewpoint. It changed. I had a different opinion than what I had previously picked up. So that was where I was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And finally, I said, hey, why don't I take a look at Wikipedia online? That's usually a highly informative source of information, and I did, only to find the information there on the Scorpion threw me into a real cocked hat. I'm confused today, and as a consequence of that confusion, perhaps we can continue and see what you think when I finish with this overview. So the Scorpion, as I said, was a nuclear-powered submarine. It used a pressurized water reactor with which I was rather familiar. And that reactor was designed by Bettis Atomic Power Labs in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and duly reviewed and looked at great detail by Admiral Hyman Rickover. And some of you may have heard of this particular individual. He was clearly the father of the nuclear navy in the United States. Now, I apologize for this rather crude photograph. I took it out of the book by Ed Offley. And let me just say that that'll give you sort of a very rough idea of a cross-section through nuclear submarine vintage 1960 to 1970. Now, let's really address what transpired with the Scorpion. In the spring of 1968, she was assigned to monitor a Soviet flotilla doing exercises in the Mediterranean. And in so doing, she was actually found by the anti-submarine capabilities of the Soviet Navy and given a particularly difficult time. She tried to escape from being contained by several anti-submarine frigates and was not really successful. But eventually, she had to leave the Med. And in so doing, as she egressed the Med, she found that she was being followed by a submarine. Obviously, most likely, a Soviet submarine. And of course, the Soviets maintained a nuclear sub to guard egress and exit to and from the Med. So this was the thought, yeah, okay, I've got someone on my backside, so be it. And just for perspective, moreover, the US had a nuclear submarine following the Soviet submarine. So basically, SSB 604, the Hado, another fast attack nuclear submarine of the US Navy, was following the so-called Soviet Guard ship to the Med. So we were having rather, how should we say, a game of cat and mouse in the Med and entering into the North Atlantic. Now, as a consequence of 2 seamen on board the Scorpion, she had to put into Rota, Spain. One of the seamen was ill, the other one had a family problem back in the United States. So she diverted to Rota, and there she was given a directive from Com-Sub Lant to investigate what appeared to be a hydrographic exercise the Soviets were conducting off of the Azore Islands. I think some of you are probably familiar with where the Azores are. So anyway, that was the directive, and this was, of course, a top secret message sent to the Scorpion. So rather than coming home to Norfolk, she diverted to head to this particular position. Now, what we know of the Soviet flotilla, it consisted of a tanker ship, a guided missile destroyer, a Krupny, as well as a nuclear submarine, an Echo-class nuclear sub. Now, as the Scorpion proceeded towards this particular locale, she found herself again being shadowed by a submarine. And of course, this was rather upsetting to the entire crew, but they couldn't shake this shadow. Now we jump ahead. The last message that the Scorpion sent to Com-Sub Lant was just around midnight on May the 21st. Now, just prior to that message, she had indicated she had positioned herself to investigate this hydrographic effort by the Soviets, but in turn indicated she is being, again, shadowed and not able to shake the shadow. But that was the last communication, May the 21st at midnight, that the Scorpion sent. And as a consequence, Com-Sub Lant sort of went frenetic in trying to raise the Scorpion and sent several messages that went unanswered. And finally, on May the 24th, Com-Sub Lant sent out a top secret message indicating that we can't find the Scorpion. We want a select group of very special, unique, and peculiar naval vessels and a few submarines still in the North Atlantic to form a search party, so to speak, and proceed to the last known position of the Scorpion and actually start looking for her. Again, I want to emphasize this was a top secret sub-miss message. And finally, the Navy was forced to recognize that the Scorpion had been lost. And that's what it did on June the 5th, that publicly declared the Scorpion lost. And of course, you can imagine the Scorpion's wives, sweethearts, families, and so forth, what they actually struggled with for that several days when, in effect, what had happened to our friends, our lovers, our husbands, our brothers, etc. And what I'd like to do now is to digress into what was called the top secret sound surveillance system that the US Navy put into operation sometime around the mid-1950s. And it consisted at the time of about 10,000 miles of underwater cabling in various places throughout the Atlantic, and attached thereto were very highly sensitive undersea hydrophones. Now, for perspective, what was the reality of this? Well, I can speak personally a little bit about it, but principally through absolute ignorance. I was a junior officer on HMCS Kootenay, and when we finished refit back in October 1961, we put to sea to do a series of exercises, and we were directed to run a particular course. And we didn't understand why we were so directed, but in so we were directed to run this course at varying speeds, or if you will, propeller rotations. Now, unbeknownst to our commanding officer and the rest of the officers on board, we really did not understand what was going on. But in retrospect, what was happening is our propeller signature was being recorded. It was being recorded on tapes and stored in computers in both Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and in Norfolk, Virginia. So what are the implications of this? Well, as it turns out, all US naval vessels and NATO naval vessels, which at that time probably included maybe 28 different countries, all their vessels, surface and subsurface, had their propeller signatures and their turbine whines, which is, I'll talk about that a little later, all recorded. Moreover, there were a number of merchant vessels that were likewise had their propeller signatures recorded. And so as a consequence, there was an inventory of a large number of vessels, ships, etc., that the US and NATO navies basically grasped as these are friendlies to us. So where were these particular cables? Where were they? Where were they lying? Well, for sure, they were certainly not in Polyarny, which was the Soviet northern sub-base for entrance to the North Atlantic. There may have been some cabling in the Barents Sea. That's questionable. I really don't know. But for sure, there were cables between the coast of Norway and Iceland. So in effect, if there were propeller signatures recorded that were unrecognized, they weren't in the library of recorded propeller signatures, what was done, it would be long-range aircraft were sent out to investigate, or if there were actually surface ships close by, they were likewise directed to investigate. And so if they saw nothing on the surface, then the conclusion was, we probably have a Soviet submarine that has now transited through the Norwegian Sea and is entering the Atlantic Ocean. So, continuing on this, what did this really mean? And I refer to some practical aspects that I encountered. You'll recall the Cuban Missile situation sort of blew up on the world in October 1962. Again, I was still a junior officer on HMCS Kootenay, and as a consequence, being in the NATO Navy aspects, we were directed to proceed to sea as an anti-submarine destroyer escort vessel. And as we reached the North Atlantic, we received a rather long communication from Ottawa, which basically told us roughly the position of, I'm not certain how many, let's pick a number, 50, 75 Soviet submarines that lined the coast of North America. Now again, we didn't know the source of this information, but in retrospect, where it was coming from was this SOSUS system, the Underwater Sonar Surveillance Program. Now, as a consequence of that information, we were directed to a position off Cape Hatteras. And Cape Hatteras was a particularly unique position in that they had a large number of radar reflectors along the coast. And our suspicion was that would be an ideal place for the Soviets to basically surface, take a radar fix, program their missiles, and if necessary, they could launch. The big point is they had to surface, program the missiles on the basis of the fix they had just taken, a radar fix, and then launch. So our objective, and that of a lot of anti-submarine ships during the Cuban Missile situation, was to keep the Soviet submarines suppressed, keep them down, keep them below the surface. And so that's what we did. And to my surprise, as officer of the watch one morning, I was literally driving the bloody destroyer. It was a Hollywood movie. Ping, boo, ping, boo, bip, ping, boo, bip, bip, bip. Guess what? A submarine ran underneath us, or we ran over one, whatever perspective you want. And we chased this submarine for 5 hours, working with two fixed-wing aircrafts, an RCAF Argus and a US Naval Neptune. And these two fixed-wing aircraft dropped a bunch of sonobuoys in an attempt to try and pen in the submarine, permitting us to keep on top of him and keep him suppressed. Now that's a real story, it really happened, and it indicated to me in retrospect the benefit, the accuracy of this SOSUS system. Now just as a matter of interest, we eventually lost the submarine due to very heavy weather and high seas. Now there's another aspect to this, and that is there was a Soviet flotilla of 3 submarines off the southern tip of Florida during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US Navy knew they were there and monitored and sat on them for 3 weeks while these guys basically baked to death in the warm ocean temperatures at that time. And again, how did they know they were there? The SOSUS system. Now, how was the information from these hydrophones actually turned into useful data? All right, and what this transpired was that the actual recorded sounds were basically passed through actuators, and they were in turn generated into electrical signals that were printed, I guess is the best way of describing it, or etched onto electrosensitized paper. And these were known as lofargrams. Now remember, we had that top secret sub-miss signal that was sent out on May the 24th, which triggered the beginnings of a secret effort to try and find the Scorpion. And again, I emphasize secret. And moreover, that particular directive triggered the Navy intelligence organization to confiscate all lofargrams that had been recorded in the Atlantic on May the 21st and May the 22nd. So the question you should be asking yourself, why did they do this? What's going on? So I leave you with that question. Now I'd like to jump ahead 14 years to April 1982. And what was actually going on was the last series of lectures training what are referred to as ocean system technicians. Now, ocean system technicians were trained to actually read and understand lofargrams in terms of frequency and intensity. And they were able to basically identify, with the library available to them of recorded propeller signatures, just what vessels were being recorded. The instructor, a petty officer by the name of Richard Falk, decided that this being the last basic presentation and course to these trainees, decided to show them a rather unique lofargram. A lofargram that had been recorded on either May the 21st or the 22nd. I don't know just which of those 2 days. But he wanted to see whether, in fact, the trainees really grasped what they were hearing and what they were seeing on these lofargrams. And what they observed was a 40-minute recording in which 20 minutes revealed 2 submarines that were able to be determined by their propeller count rates and their turbine winds. And these 2 submarines were in clearly a dogfight. A dogfight. And this again was off the Azores, relatively close to the position of that Soviet flotilla doing oceanographic studies. And all of a sudden, they recognized there had been a launch of a vehicle that had a constant propeller high frequency rate, and they immediately said, it's a torpedo. A torpedo had been launched from one of these 2 submarines. And for the next 6 minutes or so, both submarines went through a lot of evasive maneuvers. You've heard of the term a crazy Ivan, which was one of the Soviets' patented rapid turns on their submarines. And then all of a sudden, the lofargram went absolutely black. Conclusion, there was an explosion, a rather substantial explosion. 90 seconds later, they actually saw on the lofargrams the breakup of a submarine as it sank beneath crush depth. What a fantastic situation. Now let me digress again. In 1999, in the early summer of 1999, Ed Offley, who wrote this book, Scorpion Let Down, he actually found one of the ocean state technicians. His name was Vincent Collier. And he witnessed this lofarogram that basically showed a submarine actually being sunk by a torpedo. And he described the details of this to Ed Offley. And that in turn ended up in this book. And clearly his assessment was the Scorpion was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. That was his assessment, and apparently the assessment of the class. Now, jumping ahead even further to early 2007, Ed Offley was able to find now the retired chief petty officer who had basically provided the lofarogram of May the 21st and 22nd. And he engaged him in a series of conversations which resulted in the following. His name was Chief Petty Officer Richard Falk. And he had a vivid recollection of what had transpired with these lofarograms. And his conclusion was that, yes, it was an Echo submarine, a Soviet nuclear submarine. And the reason he felt so strong about this, they used a particular type of propulsion. It was called a split plant propulsion, where in effect, the electrical energy generated by the turbo generator was fed directly into an electric motor, which in turn operated the propellers. This was called silent mode operation. The regular mode basically used gearing, okay? And that would be the traditional means by which the Echo II submarines traversed the sea. But in silent mode, they used an electric motor. So as a consequence, he was able to say with great definition, it was an Echo submarine and it sank the Scorpion. Now at the time, when he was talking to his students, they said, you saw the lofarogram, but you really didn't see it. The official position is the Scorpion was lost because of unknown mechanical problems. So that was the position in '68, and I think in a great number of people's minds, it even exists today. Now, as a consequence of that sub-miss signal on May the 24th, the Navy launched a secret search for the Scorpion. And again, I want to emphasize secret search. A very selected number of vessels and perhaps even a few submarines still remaining in the North Atlantic were directed to form a search group and go to the last known position of the Scorpion and begin to investigate to see if, in effect, they could find the Scorpion. And one of the vessels that was unique and peculiar to this search group was called the Compass Island. And she was unique and peculiar in that she was used almost solely to map the undersea details of the ocean bottoms, principally for the fleet ballistic nuclear submarines that the Navy used throughout the oceans of the world. So her job was to basically map the actual undulations, undersea mountains, etc., under the Atlantic Ocean. Now, she had some unique capabilities, as you can read here. She had a very fancy sonar system, and this SAS system consisted of 61 individual narrow beam sonar transducers that were mounted perpendicular to the keel. Now, let me just have another little bit of a digression here. You talk about the Atlantic Ocean, there are no signposts out there. You really, at that time, didn't really have, let's say, global positioning systems like we enjoy today. They didn't have the satellites to help them actually find out exactly where they were. So, yes, they had a rough idea where the Scorpion was, but it was very rough. What happened was a seismic station in New Brunswick, Canada, and a seismic station in Sweden had picked up what they thought was a seismic event very early on May the 22nd. And when they extended vectors from those positions, they actually crossed at a position very close to what was eventually found out to be the Scorpion's location. Now again, they were originally thought to have been seismic events, but the explosion was sufficient to basically trigger what these two organizations thought were seismics, that earthquakes. But it turned out, in retrospect, that there was a bloody massive explosion. So I want you to remember that. Now, as a consequence of the public information release indicating the Scorpion had been lost on June the 5th, there was a formation of a naval board of inquiry trying to determine really what happened to the Scorpion. And as a consequence, they went through a whole variety of different parameters. You can see them here. Did they run into a undersea mountain? Well, no, that's really not the case. The US Navy really understood the undersea aspects of the North Atlantic. There had been a little bump in the med between the Scorpion and a tugboat in Naples when she was in port for a short period of time. And so as a consequence, there was a rather detailed examination of the Scorpion's hull at that instant, and there was no problems detected. There was also what's called a sub-safe protocol. And this applied to submarines of the vintage of the Scorpion, perhaps 8.5 years old, where in essence, the vessel had to go into dry dock for a prolonged examination, where in effect the weldments were radiographed and dipenetrant checked for cracks, incipient or otherwise. Now that sub-safe protocol was waived by the Navy, by the nuclear Navy. They thought that it was more important to keep the Scorpion at sea than to have her in this prolonged refit. But what was imposed on the Scorpion was a depth not to exceed 500 feet. Now, in retrospect, of course, we'd consider that rather shallow today, but you have to put it in the context of, well, it was probably about half the crush depth. I think the crush depth of a Scorpion type of vessel was probably around 1,100 feet in depth. The other aspect was this business about a so-called dry run of a torpedo. Now, I rather skipped over what had happened during the Scorpion's exercises a few years earlier. They had found that a torpedo, a Mark 37 torpedo, went active in a torpedo tube. Not because someone tried to turn it on, it instantaneously started to operate. And of course, this causes great consternation amongst the crew. Fortunately, these were torpedoes that had no warheads. No warheads. And so the crew was able to expeditiously shut the torpedoes down. But the question then is, well, what would happen if you had a dry run in a torpedo tube where you had a warhead on the torpedo? What would you do? Well, as it turns out, if the ship was able to turn through 180 degrees, it deactivated the firing circuit, and the explosive charge was negated. Now, just as an aside, how many of you remember The Hunt for Red October, that fantastic movie? Do you remember the Soviet Akula-class fast attack nuclear submarine actually launched a torpedo at the Red October? And the fast attack American nuclear sub, Dallas, tore across in front of that running torpedo and fouled up its basic homing characteristics. The Dallas, as you remember, crashed up out of the water, made this hellish great impact. But in essence, what happened, the homing characteristics of the Soviet torpedo somehow were confused. The torpedo went through 180 degrees and sank the Akula submarine that had launched it. Fantastic? Well, that was Hollywood. But in effect, the US Navy recognized such a problem could occur and had a fail-safe mechanism where to take the vessel through 180 degrees and you will deactivate the firing circuit. Now, similarly, if the torpedo in fact was launched and for whatever reason went through 180 degrees, it itself would deactivate the actual firing circuit. So the conclusion was it's unlikely that a dry run caused the problem, but there was still the question mark, as there had been dry runs. The bloody silver lead battery that was used in these Mark 37s was tentative. Basically, the electrolyte which prevented the operation of the battery was separated two chemicals and by an impermeable membrane. And if that membrane was ruptured or leaked, then the battery went into operation, the torpedo propellers turned on, and the guidance system became active. So this was still an issue in the back of some people's minds. Could we have had a dry run and the warhead actually blown the bow off of the Scorpion? Now, a couple of other things that really raised my eyebrows. The Naval Board of Inquiry made a declaration that where the Scorpion actually was lost, there were no Soviet bloc vessels, surface or subsurface, anywhere within a 200-mile area of the last known position of the Scorpion. Well, of course, we know that was nonsense, recognizing that ComSubLant had directed the Scorpion to basically survey, monitor, maybe even spy on that hydrographic effort southwest of the Azore Islands. And finally, the piece of resistance, which again sort of baffles me, the Naval Board of Inquiry did not have access to the SOSUS tapes of May 21, 22. Did not have access to those LOFAR grams. Now, as a consequence of that sub-miss signal that I had indicated that was sent on the 24th of May, subsequently, that specialized vessel, the Compass Island, it found the remains of the Scorpion about 600 miles southwest of the Azores. She was laying on her side at about 1,100, 500 foot depth in the sea. And interestingly, the Scorpion wasn't headed west back to Norfolk. She was headed east. And some people concluded, geez, probably they had a bloody dry run and tried to bring the boat around 180 degrees, and maybe they didn't quite make it. And the torpedo exploded in the torpedo tube and sank the Scorpion. So that was a question that pervaded a lot of people's minds. And back to those officers, the Navy nuclear officers that I befriended at combustion, that was basically what they sort of leaked to me. That in essence, in their view, the Scorpion probably ended up failing and sinking because of a torpedo explosion on board. So it was with that had a big impact on my views until I got into this Ed Hoffley's book. Now, there was a public search launched, and I haven't been able to find when that public search actually occurred. But it included the Compass Island and another unique and peculiar vessel called the U.S. naval ship Mizar. And what was unique about the Mizar, it towed an underwater sled that contained a lot of sophisticated sonar equipment, as well as a large number of underwater cameras. And on the basis of what the Compass Island had found, the position that had surfaced as a basis of the recordings of the seismic events in New Brunswick and in Sweden, the Mizar found the Scorpion and photographed it. They found it on the 28th of October, and the Navy released the fact that they had found the Scorpion on the 30th of October, when in effect she had been found several months earlier, if you recall, back on June the 9th. So the question is, what the heck's going on? Why did the Navy sit on this information for as long as they did? Now, as a consequence of what the Mizar found, one of the big issues was, gosh, what happened with the actual reactor? And moreover, the Scorpion not only contained Mark 37 torpedoes, but Mark 45 torpedoes, two of them, which had nuclear warheads. And so the real damning question was, if we've lost the submarine, what's happening with, first of all, the nuclear reactor and all the nuclear fuel? And moreover, what about the warheads on the torpedoes? And at that time, there was an effort made to determine whether there had been any nuclear contamination of the seabed, and the answer, fortunately, was none was found. Now, because the Mizar had photographed the remnants of the Scorpion, a structural analysis group consisting of a substantial number of nuclear submarine designers actually took the photographs and very carefully determined the extent of damage of the Scorpion. And you can read this as well as I can. The bloody ship was really broken up. The sail was off, the hull was broken, etc., etc. Now let's jump ahead to January the 31st of 1968 or 9. The Navy, in all its wisdom, finally published the results of the Board of Inquiry. And again, this sort of blew my mind. The certain cause of the loss of the Scorpion cannot be ascertained by any evidence now available. What do you think? I'm sure there are a number of opinions. Mine is, I disagree with that bloody statement. I think there's a big stinking cover-up someplace. Let's go on. Another digression. Some of you may have remembered the saga of the USS Pueblo. January the 23rd, 1968, this is a couple of months, 3 months before the Scorpion was lost. She had been an Army freighter and was converted by the Navy into an electronic intelligence gathering trawler. And she was stationed off the coast of North Korea in international waters, which would be about 12 miles off the coast. And she was accosted and overrun by North Korean Marines. They actually overwhelmed the Pueblo. They took all the members of the crew, 83 crew members, including 30 national security analysts. They were all taken prisoner. And as a matter of fact, they were held in North Korea for about a year. But the real ballbuster is, well, what did they really get? What they got was 7 very sophisticated radios, of which 3 were used by ComSubLant in Norfolk, and the identical radios were on all the Navy's nuclear submarines at sea. So they had access to radios that were used for communications to and from headquarters and from the submarines at sea. And these radios were basically passed on to the KGB. So the KGB actually now had the sophisticated radios that were used by the US nuclear Navy to talk to the submarines and back and forth. And that was in early, probably February of 1968, a few months before the Scorpion was lost. Now here's another beauty. May the 20th, 1985, the FBI arrested John Anthony Walker, a retired warrant officer who had served as a communications rating on several nuclear submarines, had been promoted to Chief Petty Officer and then to Warrant Officer, which is the highest non-commissioned rank in the Navy. And he was used by ComSub-Lant as the so-called watchkeeper of communications between ComSub-Lant and its nuclear submarines. So this individual was at the forefront of communications between so-called naval headquarters for nuclear operations and all its weapons at sea. Now, as it turns out, his brother, Arthur, was found to be part of this conspiracy, as well as John's son. Arthur had been an executive officer on a diesel-electric submarine, and he also was an expert in communications. And John Walker's son, Michael, was serving as a rating on the U.S. nuclear carrier Nimitz. Now get this one. He was given the task of carrying confidential, secret, and top secret information in the form of papers, reports, back to the spot on the Nimitz where these communications were to be destroyed. So what did he have access to? Their son had access to this fantastic trove of information. So with his uncle and with his father, they formed a spy ring. Now, the thing that was fascinating to me is the U.S. nuclear Navy didn't know anything about this. The FBI didn't know anything about it. What happened? John Walker's wife blew the whistle. She wondered where the hell all the money was coming from over the several years. Now he was retired, but he still seemed to have a lot of money, and he was rather furtive in some of his movements. So as a consequence, the FBI finally did investigate Walker, and of course the rest is history. Now, what did they find? They found that Walker had been repeatedly passing on crypto card details and also the details of these basic sophisticated radios, and they were very sophisticated. An average person, in fact, even a learned person, couldn't operate them without instructions. But all this detail was being passed on to the Soviet embassy in Washington. And again, I'm flabbergasted that the Navy and the FBI didn't know this was happening. Unbelievable. And the ballbuster is that John Walker, in the subsequent investigation, was found he had been passing this information on to the Soviets as early as 1967. 1967. So, put that in the context. When was the Scorpion lost? May of '68. So what the hell? When you take a look at the information from the Pueblo in January of '68, the information that Walker had provided to the Soviets as early as late '67, and you put it together and you reach the conclusion. What would the conclusion be? Well, first of all, I thought that the Navy Board of Inquiry was willfully out of the picture. They really didn't know what the hell was going on, and of course you saw the conclusion they reached in January of '69. Again, to emphasize, they never saw the loafograms of May the 21st. But by April of 1968, anyone would conclude that the Soviets had access to all communications between Komsomolets and its flotilla of nuclear submarines. The Soviets really had a reasonably good idea who was doing what to whom and where. And as a consequence, they really did have a pretty darn good idea what the Scorpion was being directed to do in investigating this hydrographic exercise. Now, what else can we say? Well, based on the SOSUS data, it looks to me like the Scorpion was sunk by an Echo 2 launched torpedo. That's what the SOSUS data showed. And I tried to instill in you the fact that the SOSUS data with which I was familiar way back in '61 and '62 was a hell of a lot more sophisticated in '68. And that's what it really indicated, that there had been a torpedo launched from an Echo 2 submarine that sank the Scorpion. Now, just to confuse everybody, and including myself, I decided, well, let me just go to Wikipedia and see what Wikipedia has to say about the Scorpion. And what they said is, do you remember that structural analysis group that had examined the photographs that the MESAR had taken of the Scorpion? This structural analysis group concluded that we don't think there was an explosion. And the reason we don't think it, nobody ever recorded a bubble pulse, which apparently occurs in every underwater explosion. So I'm saying, what the Sam hell? What does this now mean? But then you go to the next step. Well, who would have recorded the underwater bubble pulse? What frequency? What intensity? From all I can gather, this was not something the loafograms were designed to address. Moreover, it's contrary to what those seismic stations in New Brunswick and in Sweden had recorded, thinking it was a seismic event, when in effect, it probably was the explosion of a torpedo and the loss of the Scorpion. So, was there an underwater explosion, or wasn't there? You've seen the data. What do you think? What do you think? Now, another sort of interesting sidelight. Remember, there was a sub-secret message sent on May the 24th, which launched this secret hunt for the Scorpion. And part of that, there was aircraft out basically hunting for any evidence of wreckage. And one of the aircraft was an RCAF Argus. And on June the 1st, it came across a rather peculiar sight. A Soviet submarine tied up alongside a trawler. The bow of the submarine covered with a big tarp, and evidence of a substantial welding operation underway. Question: was that the Echo II submarine that had sunk the Scorpion, but basically did not leave the scene unscathed. I don't think we'll ever know, but it's an interesting piece of information that I wanted you to see. So, a couple of questions which you probably already are aware of. Why did the Navy suppress the original finding of the Scorpion on the June the 9th and didn't release it on October the 30th? Why were the loafograms kept from the Board of Naval Inquiry? One of the thoughts that I had, it appears that the Navy wanted to avoid the embarrassment of having lost control of its communications. It basically lost communication secrecy to the Soviets. Big embarrassment, big embarrassment. The other thing is, I think the Navy was sort of biased by the capabilities of its own nuclear submarine fleet and didn't appreciate that the Soviets had some pretty darn good nuclear submarines as well. And to admit this publicly would be rather awkward. So that's another facet to think about. And finally, compartmentalization within the nuclear Navy. From my perspective, in the Navy, the nuclear Navy, the left hand really didn't know what the right hand was doing. And this was willful. This was willful. The surface naval fleet didn't have a clue about the Scorpion and all this information until information was publicly released on June the 5th, and then in effect that the Scorpion had been found on October the 30th. Surface officers in the Navy didn't know what the hell was going on. And as it turns out, a lot of nuclear submarine officers also really didn't comprehend the picture. So, gentlemen, thank you. I leave this to you to cogitate. Wow. Thanks.
Great.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.